Holy Communion, Food for the Journey. This is video 8 out of 10. Chapter 7, Holy Communion in Methodism. Around the year 1733, John Wesley wrote a sermon titled, "The Duty of Constant Communion." In it, he urged his Methodists to receive communion regularly, weekly, or even daily, and dismantled a list of arguments against such a practice. In 1788, 3 years before his death, Wesley reissued his sermon with a brief note that he had shortened it a bit because I then used more words than I do now. But he added, "I thank God I have not yet seen cause to alter my sentiments in any point." This sermon was a source of embarrassment to many 19th century Methodists who preferred a religion in which the sacraments played only a small, insignificant role. Wesley's constant attendance at communion strikes us as barely short of obsessive. Whenever possible, he attended a service with communion on Sundays and even on weekdays. He notes in his diary, on a page marked communion, these following dates: November 27th and December 21st, 22nd, 23rd, 24th, 26th, 27th, 28th, 29th of 1738, and January 1st, 6th, 13th, 15th, 16th, 25th, 26th, 27th, 31st, and February 2nd, 5th, 8th, 12th, 14th, 19th, 21st, and 23rd of 1739. In this 3-month period, he communicated 38 times. Communicated is an old term used when one is receiving communion. Sometimes it was he who was serving communion in an Anglican church or to a sick person. But in most cases, even as a clergy person himself, the overwhelming number of instances were when he attended a church as a member of the congregation. Wesley urged his followers to receive the sacrament whenever they had the chance. In most cases, the Methodists were indeed devoted to the sacrament to an extent that caused one recent historian to note, "It is not commonly known today, either by Anglicans or by Methodists, that the Wesleyan revival was as much a Eucharistic revival as an evangelical revival." This Wesleyan revival included a warm and joyous interpretation of the meaning of the sacrament, as evidenced in the 1745 collection of hymns by the Wesley brothers, mainly John's brother Charles, which included 166 songs about communion. In 1745, what were Methodists supposed to do with 166 songs about communion? The answer? Methodists were to use these hymns at home for personal preparation prior to receiving communion and for follow-up meditation after reception. Likely they also sang them within their small groups called bands. These 166 songs at first were primarily for prayer and study, and apparently they were used well. The 1745 hymnal went through 11 printings. Unfortunately, most of these hymns on communion are utterly unfamiliar to us today, but a few of them remain in our current hymnal. Please pause this video in order to reflect more on question 68. Wesleyan Theology of the Eucharist, found in hymn lyrics. The 4 hymns listed here are found in the United Methodist Hymnal, numbers 613, 616, 635, and 627. O thou who this mysterious bread written by Charles Wesley in 1745. He took bread, blessed and broke it, and gave it to them. Then their eyes were opened. From Luke 24, verses 30 through 31.
O God, who this mysterious bread did in Emmaus break, return and now our souls to feed and to your followers speak. Unseal the volume of your grace, apply the gospel word. Open our eyes to see your face, our hearts to know the Lord. With you communing still, we stay till you the veil remove. Talk with us and our hearts shall burn with flames of fervent love. Enkindle now the heavenly zeal and make your mercy known, and give our pardoned souls to feel that God and love are one.
Note how the Eucharist here is connected to the post-resurrection Sunday evening Emmaus meal, not the pre-crucifixion Thursday evening Last Supper. This is often lost in the church. Open our hearts to know the Lord, based on Luke chapter 24, verse 35. Here, Holy Communion is a continuing way by which Christians recognize the presence of the risen one, not dead one, in their midst. This reflects the Wesley's Anglican insistence that the sacrament is an effective means of grace in the present, not simply a mental recall on past events. Come, sinners, to the gospel feast. Words by Charles Wesley from 1747. Come, for everything is now ready. I want my house full. From Luke chapter 14, verse 17 and 23.
Come, sinners, to the gospel feast. Let every soul be Jesus' guest. You need not now be left behind, for God has called all humankind. Do not begin to make excuse. Do not you his grace refuse. Your worldly cares and pleasures leave, and take what Jesus has to give. Come and partake the gospel feast. Be saved from sin in Jesus' rest. Oh, taste the goodness of our God, and eat his flesh and drink his blood. See him set forth before your eyes. Behold the bleeding sacrifice. His offered love make haste to embrace, and freely now be saved by grace. You who believe his record true shall dine with him and he with you. Come to the feast, be saved from sin, for Jesus waits to take
Here, believers are urged to set aside all usual excuses, particularly the one that I, a sinner, am not worthy to receive, and to take what Jesus gives, his sacramental flesh and blood. In the bread and cup, the Lord offers grace that is not to be refused. Because Thou Hast Said, written by Charles Wesley in 1748. Jesus took a loaf of bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it. From 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 23 through 24.
Because you have said, do this for my sake, the mystical bread we gladly partake. We thirst for the Spirit that flows from above, and long to inherit your fullness of love. It's here we look up and grasp at your mind. It's here that we hope your image to find, the means of bestowing your gifts we embrace, but all things are owing to Jesus' grace.
In this poem, the Eucharist is clearly a means of grace and a gift of the Spirit through which we find the fullness of divine love. We approach the table with the hope to have within ourselves the heart and mind of Christ. The Eucharist is the means of bestowing your gifts we embrace, and utterly depends on the work of Christ. But all things are indebted to Jesus' grace. Here, Wesley is balancing two important ideas. Holy Communion is neither simply a memorial of past events just to help us remember, and neither is it a mechanical deposit of grace, completely detached from Christ's redemptive work and devoid of any personal faith. It is a real channel of grace that is offered but must be accepted by us by faith. Oh, the depth of love divine, written by Charles Wesley in 1745. Jesus said to them, I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me will never be hungry. From John chapter 6, verse 35.
in spirits heaven rise, by earthly matter fed, drink to gain divine supplies, and eat immortal bread. Ask our Abba's wisdom how Christ, who did the means ordain, angels round our tables bow to search it out in vain. Sure and real is the grace, the manner be unknown. Only meet us in your ways and perfect us in one. Let us taste the heavenly powers. Lord, we ask for nothing more. Yours to bless, 'tis only ours to wonder and adore.
This is the most complex of Wesley's Eucharistic texts. Here, Wesley explains that not even the wisest person on earth can explain how bread and wine can be more than just bread and wine. They are feeble elements that appear to give nothing more than full stomachs. But bread and wine do convey a power they do not have inherently within themselves. The presence of Christ in the bread and cup is made possible by the power of the Spirit. In the third verse, the notion that Christ somehow comes down to the table in the sacrament, common to many traditions, is replaced with the suggestion that at the Eucharist we are taken upward to join the heavenly Christ. It is a mystery, says Wesley, how our spirits can rise to heaven as we eat and drink what is divine and immortal. The Abba's wisdom is Jesus Christ himself. If you would like to know how, says Wesley, then ask Jesus Christ yourself. He is the one who ordained this to us by saying, "Do this." Yet, humorously, you can ask Christ all you want how this can all be possible, but you wouldn't be able to understand it even if you were told. For the very angels of heaven hover above our communion tables in stunned reverence, unable to grasp the great mystery themselves. Wesley is telling us that communion is something to be experienced rather than be explained. Yes, Holy Communion is a reliable means of God's grace, but the manner in which this happens remains unknown. It is a divinely chosen way through which communion between God and God's church is created. Thus, we are commanded to observe it. We are asked to taste and see, not to analyze them. God's gift is to bless us. Our response is not to ask questions, but to bow in wonder and adoration. Perhaps, just perhaps, when we do, our minds will be opened. This may well be the finest hymn on the Eucharist anywhere in the English language. Specific Methodist practices. Number 1. Open communion. Methodists boast proudly of having an open communion table. This does not mean we do not care at all who partakes, but it does mean that we welcome people of all denominations and do not exclude those who have been baptized but not yet confirmed. Indeed, children have usually been welcomed at Methodist tables as soon as they could grasp the elements. But sometimes this understanding of open communion is misunderstood, making this sacred meal indistinguishable from coffee hour. Holy Communion is for the baptized, is still true even in United Methodist churches, although we don't mean for the baptized only. Instead, it would be better stated as, Holy Communion is first for the baptized. Others are welcomed too. Wesley understood the Eucharist as a converting act that allows lives to be changed and could produce in us a confident profession of faith. Those not yet baptized could be led to make a decision through the sacrament of food toward the sacrament of water. While baptism first, communion second, has been and still remains the normal way, Wesley understood that it didn't have to be the only way. Hear the words of Jeffrey Wainwright. No one should be refused communion who seeks after the saving fellowship with the Lord through the eating the bread and drinking the wine. But then they should be brought to baptism, and soon. For if this person has been drawn to the Lord's table, they, by the very receiving of the elements, have been constituted a witness to the saving work of God. But if this person refuses baptism, they are not truly earnest about entering the kingdom, and this person should not be admitted to the Lord's table again until they have been so persuaded. While Methodists do not practice barring or excommunication from the Lord's table, our current policy as United Methodists compel the clergy and lay leadership to ask those who are unbaptized but receive communion about their intentions to be baptized. It is likely that they suffer from a significant misunderstanding about the meaning of one or both of the sacraments, a fault that lies with the Church's responsibility to educate and equip. This dialogue with communicants should always remain active. This holy mystery, the United Methodist Church's official document on Holy Communion, states, the baptized present are all invited even if they belong to a different church. Those not baptized are not barred from receiving, but should be counseled and nurtured toward baptism as soon as possible. The term open communion is used by denominations to signal that they recognize the legitimacy of baptisms performed in other Christian traditions. Hence, if we recognize the validity of other traditions' baptisms, we are affirming the unity of the Church and can extend our table appropriately to those baptized in any universally recognized Christian tradition. Number 2, monthly or quarterly communion. The infrequent occurrence of Holy Communion in Methodist churches is a remnant of Wesley's insistence that only the ordained may administer the sacrament. In early American Methodism, most preachers were layfolk. They were annually licensed but not ordained, and therefore could not preside over Holy Communion. Those fully ordained were very few in number. They were put on rotating circuits over wide geographical areas, so large that they were unable to visit each location except about 4 times a year. These ministers were called presiding elders, now known as district superintendents, and conducted the business of the congregations in sessions called quarterly conferences. They also administered baptisms and the Lord's Supper on these visits. Many congregations continued quarterly communion long after they had their own appointed pastors to themselves. This is despite the fact that in his 1784 instructions to the American Church, Wesley advised the ordained elders to administer the supper of the Lord on every Lord's Day. Many United Methodist churches, as well as many churches in other denominations, are seeing the truth and benefit behind weekly communion. Number 3, wine versus juice. Wesley did not object to the use of wine, either for personal or sacramental use. He did, however, distinguish between wine and distilled spirits. The latter were to be avoided, as was all drunkenness. Methodist prohibitions against sacramental wine are rooted in the abstinence movement in the early 20th century. Today, the use of grape juice, which could not have been invented until pasteurization was perfected, allows recovering alcoholics to partake of the sacrament without fear of relapse, as well as the participation of children and youth. The term wine is retained in our liturgy because of its biblical and historical significance. Number 4, clergy preside, but no pre-consecration. In the United Methodist Church, only ordained or licensed pastors are authorized to consecrate the elements and preside at the celebration of communion, but lay people can assist the pastor. The pastor's role is essential to a proper understanding of breaking bread together. Indeed, in the United Methodist Church, members may not celebrate the Lord's Supper without the presence of a properly credentialed pastor. Pastors also should not observe the Lord's Supper without the presence of a congregation, even if that congregation is only 1 or 2 other people. A pastor should not simply go into their study and attempt to consecrate a stack of elements to send along on the youth retreat, or worse, to send to a church without a pastor. The pastor should not attempt to consecrate elements that will be frozen for later use. Why maintain such a tradition? Is it merely a way to preserve clerical power? Why not let anybody preside at the Lord's table whenever and wherever the Spirit moves them? In response to these questions, I'm reminded of the self-centered meal practices in ancient Corinth. As we recall, some were going ahead with a lavish meal, even to the point of drunkenness, while others were sneaking in at the last minute and receiving very little, if anything. That was from 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verses 21 through 22. Paul sought to correct them by laying down this simple rule. So then, my brothers and sisters, when you come together to eat, wait for one another. You should all eat together. From chapter 11, verse 33. The rule requiring the pastor or designated leader to preside at the Lord's table is an ancient discipline with a wise end in mind. It requires the church to wait for one another. That is, it requires the church to gather for the Eucharist. Many spiritual disciplines retain their integrity when practiced individually or privately, but not so with the Eucharist. By its very nature, the Lord's Supper must be a communal experience. Celebration of the Eucharist requires a pastor and a congregation. Therefore, we do not pre-consecrate the elements for use whenever or at a different time. Pre-consecration means that a pastor would pray over the bread and juice beforehand so that they do not have to be prayed over during the service. Pre-consecration fails to understand how the bread and wine are blessed. God's grace is made available through the sacraments as we thank God together in a congregational setting. Taking communion to shut-ins immediately after a communion service is an extension of the table and is acceptable, even encouraged. Consecrating the elements is not a magical act performed by the clergy or by any one person. To be very clear, the insistence that an ordained or licensed clergy person should be the one presiding over the ritual does not mean that they have any special powers or divine gifts over the people in the pews. The authority comes from the fact that the church, in the form of the annual conference, and indirectly the local congregations, has elected them to be leaders and to represent the unity of the Church Universal, ensuring Paul's demand for decency and order. Number 5, receiving the bread. Should the people take a piece or receive a piece from the pastor? It is more appropriate for the people to receive a piece of bread from those serving it, whether lay or clergy. To take a piece by tearing it off yourself says this: I can obtain salvation myself. Receiving with open palms means this: I can do nothing but receive the goodness of God. I will respond by eating it. This is a very subtle but important distinction. I'd say the most important distinction ever. Having only one person touch the bread, after having their hands sanitized, minimizes the spreading of germs as well. The Center for Disease Control issued a statement several years ago that indicated that intinction, dipping pieces of bread into a single cup, is the most hygienic way to serve communion, as long as one person tears off each piece of bread. This person has washed their hands thoroughly immediately beforehand, and the pieces are big enough for the individual to dip the bread without touching the cup or the juice with their fingers. Alternatively, the person handling the bread will lightly dip the pieces in the cup themselves before the congregant receives the elements. Number 6, online communion. This is a strange one, but a symbol of our modern times. Many churches broadcast their services on a local TV channel or on social media like YouTube or Facebook, or on some video conferencing platform like Zoom or LifeSize. In most cases, people at home watch the people in church receive communion. In some churches, shut-ins are encouraged to take a piece of bread and some juice from the refrigerator, place them up to the screen during the Great Thanksgiving, and have their elements blessed through the screen. Such questions have been raised. Can God bless through a TV screen? Does it work if the broadcast is not live? Such questions are irrelevant. Technology is not a hindrance for God. But online communion eliminates the communal experience. It lets the church off the hook from doing the more preferred way of extending the table, in which members of the church go to the shut-ins' places of residence. In times of global pandemic, in which social distancing, sheltering in place, and lockdowns are issued by the church and state, online communion may be very tempting. Such was the case during the COVID-19 pandemic. Special considerations to host online communion should be made based on the length of time these restrictions are in place. Such a determination will be arbitrary, but should still be made in conversation with other clergy members. Number 7, the real presence of Christ. This holy mystery states, the Christian Church has struggled through the centuries to understand just how Christ is present in the Eucharist. Arguments and divisions have occurred over the matter. The Wesleyan tradition affirms the reality of Christ's presence, although it does not claim to be able to explain it fully. Our tradition believes in the real, personal, living presence of Jesus Christ with us. For United Methodists, the Lord's Supper is anchored in the life of the historical Jesus of Nazareth, but is not primarily a remembrance or memorial. We do not embrace the medieval doctrine of transubstantiation, held by Roman Catholics, where the bread and wine literally turn into the body and blood of our Savior. Though we do believe that the elements are essential, tangible means through which God works. We understand that Jesus is present in relational ways, not by touching or consuming special objects. In the holy meal of the church, The past, present, and future of the living Christ come together by the power of the Holy Spirit, so that we may receive and embody Jesus Christ as God's saving gift for the whole world. Please answer questions 79 and 80 before reading chapter 8.